Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots. I'm Katie Halper.
I'm Aaron Matte. Thanks so much for being here. Our website, as always, is usefulidiotspodcast.com. Go there to support the show and get bonus content. On this week's episode, we have really undisputed number one fan favorite, Norman Finkelstein, coming back to talk to us about what can you even say anymore about Gaza, all the latest there, and the media focus on the killing of 2 Israeli embassy workers, all while the U.S.-backed slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza continues every single day, unrelenting.
Yeah, it's really I don't even know what to say. There really is nothing to say. And on top of the genocide, we have the media complicity in it.
That's the thing. It's like, how do you keep talking about something that's the most important issue in the world when there's no more words left to say? It's just, but right. The only answer is just to keep talking, and that's the very minimum we can do, is just bear witness. Yeah. And that's what we do today. And Norman, as always, has a lot of insight to offer. Let's get started with the 4 basic food groups. What do we have for Democrats Suck?
So for Democrats Suck, we have yet another story about our political parties being led by gerontocracies, but it seems like it's probably worse in the Democratic Party. So as people may know, Congressman Jerry Connolly of Virginia sadly passed away earlier this week at the age of 75 after a multi-month battle with cancer. But what is significant, I would say, is that he knew he had terminal cancer. It was reported as terminal cancer. He didn't retire. And on top of that, he was actually awarded a position as the top Democrat in the House Oversight Committee in December of 2024. And that was a month after the diagnosis. And he beat AOC in that process. He got that over AOC. Part of the reason that this is an example of Democrats sucking is because, as Matt Stoller points out, by not retiring, by being kind of like narcissistic, they are actually empowering Trump. So as Matt Stoller points out, Jerry Connolly refused to retire despite having terminal cancer. He just died. As a result, there's another empty seat that would be filled by a Democrat. That makes passing the big, beautiful bill slightly easier. Matt Stoller was right that it was easier because the vote tally for Trump's big, beautiful bill Thursday morning came to 215 in favor to 214 against in the House. And I have to add that Jerry Connolly is not the only Democrat to die in office since the current congressional session began. He is the third one. And as Branko Marcetic points out, 3 Democrats who would have made the losing vote 214 to 217 died in office this year. So basically, the budget Democrats have warned nonstop is a disaster will pass directly because of their insistence that they stay in Congress until death. What do we have for Republican Suck?
For Republican Suck, let's continue on the theme of the big, beautiful bill, as Trump coins it, which has just passed by Republicans. They're very excited about it, obviously. Let's look at what it actually contains. This is Warren Gunnels with a breakdown. He's an aide to Bernie Sanders. Trump's big, beautiful bill would eliminate health insurance for 13.7 million Americans, take food away from 4 million children, end Pell Grants for 1.4 million students, cut Medicare and Medicaid by over $1 trillion, and give the top 1% a $664 billion tax break. And let's look at one aspect of this in terms of how they're going to cut Medicaid by imposing new work requirements. This is from the New York Times. The work requirement in the bill that just passed the House represents the strictest version Republicans in Congress have ever put forward. The reporting requirements are more stringent than in previous bills. It would be easier to lose benefits and harder to re-enroll. And it would apply to a large set of Medicaid recipients, including Americans previously determined to be too old to need such requirements. So basically, people who before have been said to be too old to be subjected to these work requirements are now going to be told, hey, if you want to continue to get Medicaid benefits, you have to work, even though you previously have been ruled to be not required to because of your advanced age. So that's the Republican bill. That's the big, beautiful bill that Trump is so happy about that has just passed.
Which brings us full circle, Aaron, because it's kind of ironic. Maybe that's why these Democrats are refusing to retire. They want to work long and hard in solidarity with the regular people who are now going to have to work longer and harder.
What they're also doing in this bill is gifting new tax cuts for the ultra wealthy. And here is MSNBC breaking down just how the tax cuts in this bill, coupled with the Medicaid cuts, ultimately benefit the ultra wealthy and hurt low income people.
If you're in the top 20% of Americans, you're going to get roughly a 3.7% increase in your after-tax income, really all from these tax cuts. But if you go all the way to the bottom and everything in between essentially leads you to the bottom, if you're in the bottom 20%, you actually lose $800. Why do you lose $800? You get a very small tax cut, and you get a very large cut in Medicaid and these other benefits that we were just talking about that affects the 20% disproportionately. So this is a highly regressive bill that essentially favors the wealthy, doesn't do much for the middle class, and hurts the poor. And then if you want to see this in stark comparison, if we simply eliminated the tax cuts for people making over $500,000 a year, which is roughly what President Biden was proposing, it would save $1.1 trillion. That happens to be just slightly more than the Medicaid cuts and the food stamps, or SNAP cuts, if you will, put together. So if we simply eliminated these tax cuts, we could eliminate these budget cuts on these poor people and end up, from a budget point of view, in the same place.
So great job. Big, beautiful bill, according to Trump. So beautiful to see Medicaid being cut even further. And Trump made a big thing about he's not going to touch Medicaid. Well, that's exactly what Republicans are doing now. And we'll see what happens in the Senate. There might be some opposition to this in the Senate from Republicans. Who knows with these people? But this is an assault on low-income people. This is exactly what this is.
Yeah. So isn't that weird? As people know by now, Wednesday night, there was a shooting. 2 Israeli employees of the Israeli embassy were shot at an event hosted by the American Jewish Committee by someone who was chanting Free Palestine. But what's weird, in my opinion, is that stuff like this is getting so much media coverage, so much attention, and wall-to-wall coverage. And what's weird to me is that there's some other stories that aren't getting a lot of attention. For instance, we're not seeing a lot of news headlines about the fact that Gaza officials report that 326 malnutrition deaths, as UN says, no aid has reached Palestinians. We're not hearing a lot about that. That's kind of weird. They're also not showing Israel's live assaults that kill at least 51 in one day, 51 people in one day. Also not making a lot of news over the fact that a senior Israeli lawmaker, Nissim Vaturi, deputy speaker of the Knesset, is calling for Gaza's women and children to be separated so the men can be executed en masse. This is not a misquote. It's a genocidal call from the heart of government, and the world says nothing. And the Gaza Health Ministry just released a comprehensive list of the number of children killed in Gaza by Israel, 16,503. It's kind of weird how openly the media and our political elites value the lives of certain people over others. And a couple more weird things I just want to point out. So let's take a look at these other weird things. And this is a story in which a Jewish man mistook 2 Israeli tourists for Palestinians and opened fire on them in Miami. Another weird thing that Remy Kanazi points out: a Palestinian 6-year-old was stabbed to death in Chicago. A Palestinian 3-year-old was almost drowned to death in a pool. A Palestinian teen was stabbed in Texas. Palestinian students were shot in Vermont. And as he points out, hate crime after hate crime as bombs continue to pummel Gaza. But what I would like to point out is, isn't it weird that those things didn't cause a media and political meltdown the way the shooting of these 2 people is?
Well, on that note, isn't that terrible? While the corporate media hyper focuses on these 2 deaths while ignoring all those other crimes that you've just outlined when it comes to violence against Palestinians from the U.S. to Gaza, Israel supporters are also using the embassy killings to, of course, demonize any supporter of Palestinian rights, including Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the head of something called the Anti-Defamation League, but people call it the Apartheid Defense League, which is a much more accurate acronym. And he went on CNN and he decided that the killing of 2 Israeli embassy officials in Washington was a good time to go and attack Twitch streamer Hassan Piker, who supports Palestinian rights and speaks often about Palestine.
All of us need to call it out. I'm thinking about the New York Times doing a gauzy profile a few weeks ago of this gamer, Hassan Piker, who regularly employs awful genocidal rhetoric against Jewish people in the Jewish state. Like, extremists should not be empowered. People who spout prejudice should not be platformed. This is a moment when we need to look ourselves in the mirror and say, we've got to stop this because the consequences are deadly.
Yeah, look yourself in the mirror and ask, do I ever put out genocidal rhetoric? And yes, I do, because I'm Jonathan Greenblatt. That's what I do all the time. And if you're the CNN host and someone says, yeah, that this streamer, Hassan Piker, adopts genocidal language, then doesn't it occur to you to say, okay, so what's an example? Like, what did he say?
Exactly.
Like you make an allegation, a very serious allegation against someone, like a public personality like Hassan Piker. Don't you want to back it up with some evidence? Aren't you CNN? Aren't you supposed to care about some remote connection to basic facts? And of course, there are none because Jonathan Greenblatt smearing Hassan Piker, as many people are doing. I think what's going on there, it's like people like Jonathan Greenblatt, they love the New York Times. They love to pick it up. It reinforces their worldview because the New York Times is constantly parroting Israeli propaganda. Occasionally, they'll throw in some token acknowledgments of Palestinian rights. But for the most part, it serves as Israeli propaganda. And Jonathan Greenblatt's still mad that he saw Hassan Piker get a nice profile in the New York Times. It just can't happen. You have to have like 100% complete uniformity. You can't just tolerate, if you're Jonathan Greenblatt, 99% uniformity with Israel. So he wants to go on CNN and complain about it.
Well, if you think it's terrible that the ADL is blaming Hassan for the shooting, you may be interested to know who the Israeli government is blaming for the shooting, and that would be none other than Israel's Democratic Party leader, Yair Golan, who is also a reserve major general in the IDF and former soldier and commander himself. He said on Israeli public radio on Tuesday that Israel is, quote, on the way to becoming a pariah state like South Africa was if we don't return to acting like a sane country. And he also said that Israel kills babies as a hobby. So, according to the Israeli government, the shooting that happened in Washington, D.C. is this person's fault. Israeli Heritage Minister Amihai Eliyahu said that Yair Golan's blood libels echo among Nazis and Israel haters around the world. We are now paying the price for them in the deadly attack in Washington, and history teaches us that we will pay more in the future. Yair, the blood of the embassy workers is on your and your colleagues' hands. My sincere condolences to the families of the murder. Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, and Kahanist and genocidal racist terrorist who actually served jail time, said, unfortunately, the anti-Semites in the world draw encouragement from villainous politicians in Israel who accuse IDF soldiers of murdering children as a hobby, the blood of those murdered by them.
And those have been your 4 basic food groups. For this week's guest, we are joined by returning champion, Useful Idiot's fan favorite, Norman Finkelstein, who so many of us rely on for his analysis on Israel-Palestine. He wrote a really important book about Gaza. Actually, one of the few works out there, the few political histories of Gaza. It's called Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. That's a vital read. And he has a new book coming out later this year called Gaza's Gravediggers, an inquiry into corruption in high places. And this is where Norman takes a look at the world's highest court, the International Criminal Court, and how basically for all the activity that's happened there, and there have been arrest warrants against Israeli leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, that's also been a source of a huge cover-up of not holding Israel to account for war crimes. And that's what Norman focuses on in his forthcoming book. But today, on today's show, we're going to talk about all the latest in Gaza and Norman's unfortunately very bleak outlook for the future. So let's go to Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein, thank you so much for coming back to Useful Idiots.
My pleasure, as always.
Let's start with what is the top news in the U.S., the shooting of 2 Israeli embassy officials outside an event in Washington, D.C. What we know so far is that the alleged shooter chanted Free Palestine. There's also a manifesto that's been purported to be written by him, although that we haven't confirmed that. There's so much going on in Gaza, atrocities day by day. I feel a little, it feels a little inhuman to talk
I
about
know.
2 deaths in Washington when there's hundreds, thousands of deaths going on in Gaza. But what is your reaction?
Well, my first reaction is that before a public, you have a responsibility not to just throw the bull. You have to have the facts and then make a careful evaluation on the basis of the facts. When I first read about this morning, my initial reaction, I thought it had occurred at the Israeli consulate, and I assumed it was a Palestinian who had committed the action. And my first reaction was to remember, I don't know if you folks will know, the fellow Herschel Greenblatt. He was the one who assassinated the second level diplomat in the German legation, I think it was in Paris. And he was Jewish, Herschel Greenblatt, and that triggered Kristallnacht. And if you look at the literature on Greenspan, there's a lot of speculation about him. He was an obscure figure. He had reacted to reports about the forced movement of Jews. I think it was either in Germany or Poland. I think it was Poland. I can't remember. In any case, he reacted in sheer horror at what was being done to the Jews. I think it was his parents among them. And he did an act. He went into the German legation in Paris and he shot the second person in charge. Of course, the Germans called it an act of terrorism, and that's what triggered Kristallnacht. In those circumstances, given that he did assassinate a representative of the German government, and as a representative of the German government, he bears responsibility for the actions of the German government. I'm not aware of anybody who condemned Greenspan. And I've read the literature quite closely. I'm not aware of anybody who condemned him for the act, even though you could say it was not a very smart thing to do because it triggered Kristallnacht.
When you say aware of anyone who condemned him, who are you referring to?
Historians. I mean, that was
Yeah.
it triggered Kristallnacht. So
Right.
obviously, there's a lot of talk about that incident, or a lot written on that incident. So that was my initial reaction. But then that turned out to be wrong because of two things. It didn't occur in the Israeli consulate. It occurred apparently in front of a Jewish museum in Washington. And secondly, it's unclear at this point whether the alleged perpetrator or whether he was even aware that these two people worked in the Israeli consulate, or they just happened to be in front of that museum. So that throws a large number of variables into the equation. I did read the alleged manifesto he wrote, everything alleged because we really don't know. And I have to say, it was at quite a high level of sophistication. He talked about an incident in Guatemala with a Guatemalan doctor who was operating on some patients, and then the Guatemalan, what were they called back then? They weren't called terrorists, paramilitaries. They came into the hospital and they killed the patient. And the doctor commented about how he sees the murderers walking in the streets all the time with that heartless grin. And then he talked about an incident with a figure who was very famous in my generation, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara.
Right.
The Vietnam War was famously called McNamara's War, and somebody who sought revenge on him. And I know the Vietnam War like the back of my hand, and I wasn't even aware of this incident. So I'm bringing it all up because there seems to be this big disconnect between a sophisticated manifesto and a fellow just going randomly in front of a Jewish museum in Washington and attempting to assassinate two people who presumably he thought were Jewish, although there's no reason even to presume they were Jewish. It could have been just visitors going to the museum. So everything remains foggy now. I would say for me, a bottom line is it could have been a nutty guy. That's always possible. Ted Kaczynski, he was a Harvard graduate. The manifesto he wrote wasn't altogether crazy, but he embarked on a crazy project, one by one assassinating individuals who he believed were responsible for bringing us to the point of destruction. So it could be a smart guy with a crazy project. It could be a crazy guy with a crazy project. I don't really know. What I would leave it there.
It's interesting. I just have to add that one of the victims of the shooting, they were both employees of the Israeli embassy, and one of them is a Christian Zionist who emigrated to Israel from Germany and joined the IDF and became a citizen. I wanted to though talk about the way this incident is being responded to, and then of course we're going to talk about what the media should be talking about, which is the murder and starvation of Palestinians. In fact, I believe Asal Rod tweeted out something very clever like, so this is what media coverage, wall-to-wall media coverage looks like. It's been a choice up until now, implying that, the wall-to-wall media coverage of this killing is what we should have been seeing about the killing of Palestinians. But here's one response, which comes from Florida Congressman Randy Fine. Let's hear how he responded to this shooting.
The fact of the matter is the Palestinian cause is an evil one.
Yeah, and Congressman, there is a ceasefire deal on the table right now that the White House is hoping both Israel and Hamas will sign on to. Does this shooting change anything when it comes to the course of the war or the negotiations to end it?
Well, I think it speaks to the importance of the only end of the conflict is complete and total surrender by those who support Muslim terror. In World War II, we did not negotiate a surrender with the Nazis. We did not negotiate a surrender with the Japanese. We nuked the Japanese twice in order to get unconditional surrender. That needs to be the same here. There is something deeply, deeply wrong with this culture, and it needs to be defeated.
So how do you respond to that, Norman?
How do I respond to that? Well, the logical conclusion is that we should just nuke the whole Arab world. If it's the quote unquote culture, Muslim culture, fundamentalist culture, I don't know what he has in mind. But the logical conclusion would seem to be that we should just nuke the whole Arab world and that would solve the problem. I don't really, honestly, you reach a point of derangement where it just doesn't seem sensible to engage it. He has the right to say whatever he wants, but to invoke the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in light of the killings of two individuals in Washington is just a degree, a magnitude of derangement and insanity that it's very hard to engage. Yeah. One should try, I think, to stick to factual issues and not psychiatric ones.
The problem here is that people like that are not only members of Congress, as Randy Fine is, but inside Israel, that kind of thinking is very dominant. You have Israeli politicians openly talking about how every baby in Gaza is our enemy. And unfortunately, these views are widely held. I mean, what are your thoughts on Israel right now in terms of its place as a unique society on the spectrum of lunacy, of just collective insanity, in the same way that Nazi Germany was an example of just outright collective insanity? Where do you situate Israel in that right now?
To be perfectly honest with you, as I should be, I do meditate on that question a lot. And I'm not really sure if my historical scope is sufficient to make a balanced judgment. What I would say is the following things, nothing in extenuation, just putting it in the right historical context. There was a very good book written probably about 30 years ago now by a fellow named John Dowers, Dowers. It was called War Without Mercy. And it was a description of the kinds of language, public presentation during the U.S. war with Japan. And it was on both sides. The Japanese demonizing to the point of satanic description of the U.S., meaning everyone in the U.S., and the U.S. doing the same thing with the Japanese. If you read the book, it's very, very ugly. How the U.S. depicted the Japanese, the attitudes towards the tortures of Japanese, the glee at, for example, the incineration of Tokyo during World War II. I mean, glee. Then, if you read about our own Indian wars, as they were called, the kinds of insanity that came out of very respected figures, even in retrospect, if you read Theodore Roosevelt's The Winning of the West, it's a 5-volume work he wrote, and his descriptions of Native Americans will make your skin crawl, I believe. So in that respect, you can't say Israel is completely aberrant in the historical. In the broad history, these kinds of psychopathic outbursts are not unusual, especially after October 7th, where kind of all the demons in Israeli society, which for one reason or another they had to repress or suppress, all the demons rose to the surface, and all of the ugliness of that society. They felt they now, after October 7th, they had license, they had moral license to publicly espouse. I think a lot of it was repressed. It was there. If you scratched the surface with any Israeli, their loathing and contempt for Arabs in general and Gazans in particular. It was there, but there was always, it's a Western country, so there was a veneer of being civilized, and what October 7th did was it enabled the Israelis to free themselves from that veneer and for all the demons to rise to the surface. I would say, on the other hand, I would say Israelis, unlike Nazi Germany, they don't have the pretense or the pretext that they didn't know what was happening. Now, I'm not saying Germans didn't know. Germans, even though it was a totalitarian state, even though they were being barraged with the propaganda of this being a Judeo-Bolshevik war that was being unleashed on Germany, that it was because of the Judeo-Bolsheviks that the German soldiers were freezing to death, literally, on the Eastern Front, and they're being barraged with this propaganda over and over and over again, incessantly. The fact is, they may not have known about the concentration camps or the death camps. They knew about the concentration camps. Did they know about the systematic extermination? There is debate about that, but they certainly knew enough to know something horrible was happening. because you have to remember 50% of the Jews who were killed were just lined up and shot down. They weren't in Auschwitz or in concentration camps. It was on the front. They're lined up, shot down, in some instances like Babi Yar, in the tens of thousands. So somebody had to be doing the shooting. And there had to have been conversation about what was happening. So they knew. But they have a pretext or a pretense that they didn't know. The propaganda, the totalitarian state, and so forth. In Israel, everybody knows. At the beginning, even people like Gideon Levy, who I respect for sure, even they were saying, well, the Israeli media is disguising what's happening, and the Israeli media is just an echo chamber of Netanyahu and his cohorts, and so the Israelis are poorly informed. That's, with all due respect to Gideon Levy, that's complete nonsense. Israel has the highest usage of the internet of any country on earth. The Israelis were posting on the social media what they were doing. So whatever Haaretz or Yediot Aharonot or the others were saying, the Israeli soldiers were posting and boasting of what they were doing. Every Israeli knew and knows exactly what's happening. What has happened since October 7th, it is incorrect to describe it as a state project. That's incorrect. It's a national project. Israel has a citizen army. It's representative of the cross-section of Israeli society. The people carrying on the genocide are representative of, anchored in Israeli society. If it's not the person, him or herself, it's an uncle, it's a father, it's a brother, it's a son. They all know.
Daughter.
A daughter. They all know, they all approve. Every poll taken since October 7th has shown that roughly 95% of Israelis believe, knowing full well what's going on, 95% believe that Israel is using enough or too little force in Gaza. That is, 40% think Jewish Israelis believe that Israel is not using enough force in Gaza. So, in answer to Aaron's question, I have to be sensitive to other historical examples I've seen. For example, the US with Japan, the US during the Indian Wars. On the other hand, I do think that at least in the current world, let's say since World War II, this is in a class all its own for many reasons. I mean, the sheer numbers, since the 21st century, the last 25 years, it's unique in every category. There's just nothing like it. If you use any metric whatsoever, this falls into a totally different category, what Israel is doing in Gaza. And in terms of it being a national project, yes, I do believe it falls into a category. Then the implicit question in what Aaron asked is, what degree of legitimacy does Israel lose as a consequence of the last 19 months? Does it lose its right to exist as a state? Does it lose any moral legitimacy any longer as a state? I'm sure people wake up thinking that place needs to be wiped out. And I try very hard to reason it through. What does the past 19 months mean? But you can ask yourself, Aaron, the Japanese committed horrific atrocities during World War II. I mean, they killed 25 million Chinese. That very little place called Japan, 25 million Chinese they wiped out. And we don't have to talk about the atrocities committed by the Germans. But very soon after World War II, for better or for worse, they rejoined humankind. So I don't have an answer. I suppose it's the job of a historian to ponder it. But right now, I guess now is not the time to ponder it. Right now, I think the job is to chronicle it accurately and do what one can do in the current circumstances, which seems rather limited, and to bear in mind who are the culpable characters here. Who are the culpable characters here? And to be accurate about that. Is it Trump? Right now, Trump is the head of state. But did he begin it? Did he open the door? Did the horrors begin with his inauguration? That's just not true. I get many emails every day from people who are feeling hopeless, hoping that I can show some light at the end of the tunnel, and I can. There's just something so morally abominable, and this is already a cliche, and I try not to lapse into cliches, that the Times has 3 articles on this couple.
The couple in D.C. who were killed. Yeah.
And 3 days ago, it was reported that 14,000 Gazan babies would die in 48 hours if food doesn't get to them. I think that might have gotten one sentence in the Times. 14,000 babies will starve to death if food doesn't get to them within 48 hours.
Now, there was some controversy about that warning because there was a question whether that was the exact precise warning or whether the warning was simply that there were 14,000 babies in Gaza who were at risk of starvation. But regardless, whether it's 48 hours or starvation over a longer period, it doesn't matter. The point is the figure was 14,000 babies are seriously at risk over some period of time.
And have already they've already been dying of it. That's the other thing that one would think would be noted by our media. That children are starving to death. Not starving to death, they're being starved to death.
And that just wouldn't have happened if the coverage had continued. If you look at the trajectory of the last 20 months, what is the trajectory? Right after October 7th, Gallant, at that point, the defense minister Gallant announced, quote, "We will not admit any food, fuel, water, or electricity into Gaza." Now, it was perfectly obvious to any sane person, and I was on several programs at that time, several web programs. If you don't admit any food, fuel, water, or electricity to a hermetically sealed place, which is what Gaza is, that's a formula for genocide. Now, what happened? They wanted to persist on that path, but there was an international uproar over what Israel was doing in Gaza. And at that point, President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken, because of the international uproar, exerted pressure on Israel to at least relax, if only slightly, those orders. No food, fuel, water, electricity. And it was a very uneven process. Israel would relax a little, then institute it again. Then they got bad publicity in March 2024 with the ICJ, International Court of Justice opinion, saying they had to admit more food into Gaza. And then there was, if you remember, the Central Food Kitchen incident, which also got them a lot of bad publicity. And then they relaxed their blockade a little for about 3 weeks. So it was off and on. And to the extent that they relaxed the blockade, it was because of international publicity. There was no question about that. And of course, the major moment was the encampments in the spring, which really focused a very sharp light on what Israel was doing. They were remarkably successful because the media kept covering it for quite a long time, for about, 3 weeks. The media was focusing on it, and that's why they had to be crushed. Israel's agents, people like Bill Ackman, they determined that the encampments had to be crushed. Now, once Trump was elected, what happened to the media coverage? It just disappeared. The whole front page of places like the Times became Trump, 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 Trump. There'd be 8 articles. And once the media coverage disappeared, there was no longer any pressure on the Israeli government. So what'd they do? They went right back to what Gallant announced the second week in October. No food, fuel, water, or electricity. It was the same order. The only reason that order had been relaxed somewhat was because of the publicity. So what does that tell you? If the major media had continued to focus on what Israel was doing in Gaza, they would have been forced to stop. Now you say, no, because Trump wasn't as susceptible to media pressure as Biden and Blinken. That's not true. Trump didn't want to have the Gaza albatross around his neck. If the media had kept up its coverage, he would have told them stop. Because he knew one thing from the Biden-Blinken years. He knew that Gaza had become an albatross for Biden and Blinken, and he didn't want it on his watch. So if the media had kept up with the coverage, the pressure would have been on Israel again. Trump would have put the pressure on Israel again, but there was none. The moment the media coverage vanished, I don't know if you remember, it's so short time ago, but people forget. It was during the month leading up to the presidential election when Kamala Harris was nominated. At that point, all the media attention was focused on the election once there was the Democratic Party nominee. There was a massacre every day. There was a massacre, 60 people today, 300 people tomorrow, 200 people. It was a massacre every day. No coverage because they were focused on the electoral cycle. And one thing you can say about Mr. Netanyahu, he knows the American media. And he watches it very carefully for what? He watches for an opportunity. Once the cameras switch in a new direction, he exacts everything he can out of that moment. He exacts everything he can out of that moment. So it was, in my opinion, the main enabler of the horrors that have befallen Gaza in the last 2 months and so. I guess it's 19 months, they say. It's 11 weeks. Yes, the last 11 or 12 weeks since they announced the new order for no food, fuel, water, or they revived the old order of no food, fuel, water, or electricity. It's because the media stopped covering it. It was a combination of that, and it was 3 things. The media stopped covering it, the crushing of the encampments, which crushed the student movement, and the failure to come up with a new tactic So what do you do now? What is the weak point that we can exploit? And the people were unable to rise to the occasion. It was obvious that the demonstrations had lost their capacity to mobilize public opinion, and there needed to be a new tactic. Personally, I said at the time, the main tactic I would have proposed is to link free Gaza and free speech on the college campuses, and for them to gradually escalate. For the students, you start off by wearing a T-shirt that says genocide, just one word, genocide. Will the university officials come down on that? Hard to say. Then you could escalate to genocide, and on the back, Gaza. Will the university officials come down on that? And gradually, Israel's committing genocide in Gaza, Amnesty International, to see how far you can force the issue of free speech in Gaza. The problem was, as far as I could tell, everybody was so scared, on the college campuses. There were very few people who were now ready. It was a risk. We have to be clear about that. If you attended the encampments, I imagine both of you attended some of them. At places like MIT and elsewhere where I went, there were overwhelmingly minority students. And a large percentage were foreign students. So it was a risk, the deportation fear, being snatched off the street fear. It was real risks. And one shouldn't diminish that. Look, I don't want to be unfair. I recognize the risks. And I do believe the foreign students should have been allowed to step aside. And those of us who have the protections of being an American citizen, we were responsible to be in the lead. But on the other hand, as I told the students, there was some disagreement because, as you know, they were wearing the masks, the keffiyehs, and covering their faces. Their reason was they were afraid of being doxxed. That was the argument. I said, look, folks, I can get that, but part of being in a cause is accepting the fact of danger and sacrifice. During our civil rights movement, young Black people, 20, 21, they were going into these very remote hamlets in the South where the mayor was in the Ku Klux Klan, the police chief was in the Ku Klux Klan, the judge is in the Ku Klux Klan, and they were knocking on doors asking people to come out to vote, to register to vote.
And some of them were killed, obviously.
Many of them were killed.
Yeah, many, right, I should say. Yeah, many, yeah.
I understand their fears, but on the other hand, maybe they should have found the courage. I don't know the answer. I knew the campments were going to face a very tough time. I knew they were going to face the tough time in the summer after the spring, when they went home and their parents laid down the law. I'm not paying $50,000 in tuition for you at, it's $80,000, $90,000 at Columbia. I'm not paying $90,000 tuition plus room and board. I'm not paying $90,000 for you to get expelled. So I knew the pressure now from their parents was going to be very tough. And I was skeptical that it would resume, the resistance would resume in September. And it didn't. I know those pressures. I could just imagine my parents, my father, a factory worker, $50,000, $80,000, and you're going to go get arrested or expelled. I can get what happened. But it was a big loss. I mean, it's very hard to believe. A full year has passed since the encampments. A full year. Nothing happened. This whole academic year, completely dead. It's the power, the force they exerted was really quite extraordinary.
We should say there were a few sporadic protests, like Colombia recently. There was an occupation, there was a sit-in.
Yeah, it was mostly. I talked to people about that. It was completely unthought out. It was 18 or 19-year-olds who had missed out last year and wanted to be part of, expressing their.
There were some good. I think there were some good stuff that happened in solidarity with Mahmoud Khalil, that weren't just people who had missed out. They chained themselves to the gates.
Yes, but it was. Look, I don't want to diminish any resistance, but you recognize, Katie, that was a handful of people.
Sure. Yeah.
Like 10 people.
Right. Didn't shut anything down.
The encampments engaged entire communities. Professors were holding classes there. Other professors were sending food. Look, it got a lot of news attention, and it spread. It started here before you knew it was in Europe, and then before you knew it was everywhere. That's why they had to be crushed.
Returning to Aaron's question to you, Norman, about Israel's kind of status, becoming a pariah state, I wanted to actually ask you about the recent statement made by Yoav Golan, who is the Israel Democratic Party leader. He had some interesting statements that he made on Tuesday on Israeli public radio. And Yair Golan is not just Israel's Democratic Party leader. He's also a reserve major general in the IDF and, of course, a former soldier and commander.
Israel is on its way to becoming a pariah state among nations, like South Africa was, if we don't return to acting like a sane country. And a sane country does not wage war against civilians, does not kill babies as a hobby, and does not give itself the aim of expelling populations.
What are your thoughts on this statement, this admission from an Israeli that the IDF kills children?
Well, my first reaction is a very idiosyncratic one. I was hoping somebody would pull that clip and juxtapose it next to that thing called Destiny and Benny Morris when I was in the debate with them. For a historian, I don't want to understand Israeli society. If you want to know the truth, I don't want to. I don't want to get inside their heads.
That's the problem.
90% of
a good historian tries to get into the heads of the various protagonists.
There's a limit. When 90% of Israelis think that Israel's using enough or too little force in Gaza, I don't want to get inside that head. 40% think that Israel is using insufficient force in Gaza. I don't want to get inside that head. I don't want to get inside the head of people who think they're using insufficient force against the population, half of which is children. I don't want to get inside that head.
No, you don't know Israeli pilots. They believe that they are killing Hamasniks. They're given certain objectives, and that's what they attack.
Every time they target a kid, I'm sure they believe it's Hamas. And the issue came up of whether Israel kills children. And they laughed off the whole idea, said it's totally crazy. And I began to give examples. And each example they sought to refute. And then I gave what seemed to me the most compelling example, which was the March 2018 March of Return in Gaza. Great March of Return, it was called. The UN report, which was very thorough, ran to 250 pages, single-spaced. It said that Israel was targeting children, targeting journalists, targeting medics, targeting disabled people. When it didn't outright kill them, it was targeting them at the kneecap to give them life-changing injuries. And all of it was exhaustively documented. And that thing called destiny. He was very agitated at the claim. Benny Morris tried to distance himself, the Israeli historian. He tried to distance himself from what the March 2018, but they were both very adamant. So there was a certain relief, you might call it, on my part, when the Israeli official or opposition party official, he said, but everybody knows Israel targets the children. You might recall that Pharaoh Sidwa, the doctor who was in Gaza, he and I think it was something like 60, you can correct me, 60 other doctors and medical personnel, they provided enough evidence to convince the New York Times that children were being targeted in the head and in the chest. And then there was an uproar when the Times published that. And then the Times had no choice. It said, look, we looked at the x-rays. We looked at the x-rays. We couldn't reach another conclusion. So obviously it strengthens the case when this person says it, but it's nothing new under the sun. What happened in Gaza since October 2023, there's nothing new in what it's doing. What's different is the quantity. And the cliche is at some point, quantity turns into quality. So you might murder an individual, but when it becomes 100 individuals, the murder becomes a massacre. And if the 100 individuals turns into 1,000 individuals, it becomes a crime against humanity. And if the 1,000 individuals turns into 1,000,000, it becomes a genocide. So at some point, quantity turns into something qualitatively different. But there's nothing new in the Israeli tactics. That to me is, for anybody who studied it, nothing new under the sun. Or I should say nothing new under the Israeli sun.
Just the newsworthiness of it is that a opposition party leader is admitting it.
Yeah, and it was newsworthy that he used the word as a hobby.
Right.
As in, not only do they not experience any remorse, but what's a hobby?
Fun.
Listen up, guys. A hobby is something you do for fun.
Right.
And that's exactly true. That's Israel. That's why, in my opinion, I'll give you just a brief preview, and you can do with it as you like. On June 9th, I will be in a public presentation with Dr. Cornel West and the former executive director of the ACLU. Her name is Nadine Strassen, a very impressive woman by any reckoning, a very impressive woman. And I will ask the question in good faith, not as a provocation. I will ask the question. The title of the event is Cancel Culture, Freedom of Speech in Gaza. And we're going to talk or focus, I hope, on the events on the college campuses and how they bear on the issue of freedom of speech. Now, if you read the Harvard reports on this alleged anti-Semitism at Harvard and so forth, everyone talks about the need for inclusion and what's called pluralism, which is, in Rodney King's famous line, can't we all get along? And the job of a college, they say the job of a college is people from diverse backgrounds, diverse opinions, contrary opinions, strongly felt opinions. Can't we all get along? Can't we be inclusive? Can't we cultivate a culture of pluralism? And as a general directive, that sounds to me right. But I do think since the Harvard report and others have focused on the Israeli Jewish students who feel shunned and are being shunned, they don't only feel it, it's a fact, they're being shunned. My view is the default setting is anybody coming out of Gaza is a war criminal. The default setting is not innocent until proven guilty. You are a participant. You are a cog in the machine of genocide. And that being the case, do we have a responsibility to make that student feel inclusive? Does everybody have a responsibility to be inclusive of that person? I have to say, I have very mixed feelings about that. If one of those persons who served in Gaza came to me during office hours, I would have very mixed feelings about trying to make him or her feel inclusive. If the genocide is a national project, then everybody has to bear his or her share of culpability for participation in that project. So I have very mixed feelings about the call now. And if you look at, there were two reports issued by Harvard, one a task force on anti-Semitism and another a task force on anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim attacks. But one thing the two reports had in common is at the end they talked about the need for inclusion and the need for pluralism and the need for figuring out how we can all get along. Well, dare I say, I don't want to get along with a genocidal murderer. I really don't. For me, it's a complete betrayal of my family history, my legacy. If most of the Germans who served during World War II, they got off for a very simple reason. That too was a national project. And if you were to prosecute everybody, you'd have a whole country in jail. So they had to be very selective in who they prosecuted. You take the worst guard in the camp in Majdanek, where my mother was there. Her name was Brigida. She was, by reputation, the worst. Everybody was terrified of her. So she went through the trial in Majdanek. It was the charge. It was a trial of the guards from Majdanek. It was held in Dusseldorf in the late 1970s. And my mother testified at the trial. And the testimony of her and many others was quite vivid when it came to Brigida. So Brigida gets 7 years in jail, or 7.5 years in jail. Okay? She gets out of jail. She could have attended night school. I could have taught her. Do I want her to feel inclusive? Do I want to create an environment of inclusiveness? Not really. Not really. So when the Jewish students talk about being shunned, and in particular the Israeli Jewish students talk about being shunned in places like Colombia or elsewhere, I think shunning them is the morally correct thing to do.
Yeah, it's the minimum.
I honestly, I'll be honest with you, no point in predifying the situation. I never felt comfortable with the BDS anti-normalization campaign because I understood it. You isolate, in the case before BDS, you isolate South Africans. It's a way to exert pressure on them, and then they will exert pressure on their government because your government's actions are causing us to be ostracized, and therefore we have to change our actions so we can end this ostracism of us. I got that, and that seemed a reasonable tactic, the ostracism. I think it's a tough tactic, for example, if you're a professor. The person is a student there at your school. Do you refuse to talk to them during office hours? Do you not acknowledge their existence in class? When you come down to the practicalities, it's very hard to figure out what exactly should happen. But the anti-normalization, as advocated by BDS, the anti-normalization, it had an undercurrent of these people aren't part of the human race. And that part made me feel a little creepy, or made it feel a little creepy. And so I had a problem with it. You're going to disagree with me. I mean, that's how I'll just give you an example. Look, I live in an old Jewish neighborhood. There are a lot of Israelis in my neighborhood. Up until October 7th, look, we didn't get along, but occasionally I would talk to them. After October 7th, I couldn't talk to them anymore.
But isn't that different from an official policy?
Well, what the Israeli Jewish students were claiming, and the Jewish students, they were claiming that it was an official policy to keep them out of clubs, like at Harvard and Columbia, to exclude them from clubs. That certain clubs made it a provision that in order to be a member of the club, you had to be anti-Zionist.
But I meant the policy being BDS. Like, there's a difference between talking to neighbors, I think, and saying we're going to try to exert political pressure on a government. But what's interesting, Norman, about what you're saying is I feel like you yourself just argued that it's not just a state project, right? It's a national project.
That's why I said, at this point, I think shunning these folks, you're coming back, these are young people who are attending college. They're coming back from Gaza.
Right. With blood on their hands.
Yeah, a lot of blood.
Right. Baby blood, women blood.
A lot of baby blood. And you expect that's all behind us? Right. Now, Rodney King, can't we all get along? And why can't I come to your frat party? And why can't we go out for drinks and whatever else? No. If I were to agree to that, it would be a betrayal of everything, of my family history. And I won't do it.
Yeah. Look, in the time we have left, I want to talk about some current developments. Let's focus on what's happening in Gaza. So you have the starvation siege. Israel finally allowing a trickle of aid coming in, a few trucks. And it's not even clear how much of the aid that's being allowed in is actually reaching people. You also have increasing attacks on hospitals. It's hard to keep track of all the atrocities.
You can. It's an atrocity a day. And that was the inevitable result of it falling off the front page.
But some of the recent attacks on, I just want to mention them, just to name them. The European Hospital, the Al-Ada Hospital. There was a hospital serving amputees. I mean, it seems as if Israel is just going absolutely ballistic. I mean, not that they haven't been for the last year and a half, but the starvation siege coupled with the intense attacks, and now the plan to basically force the people of Gaza into even smaller areas. I mean, Norman, like, what's your sense of what Israel is doing right now and what their plans are for Gaza?
I think it's absolutely consistent. Nothing has changed. I said from day one, their goal was to, for once and for all, solve the Gaza question. It was the final solution.
Yeah.
They first tried expulsion. Expulsion was nixed when the Arab countries said, we're not taking them. They then tried to make Gaza uninhabitable and simultaneously commit large-scale massacres in the hope that, which is a completely rational hope, and Trump was absolutely right when he said, upon coming into office, he said, there's nothing in Gaza anymore. There's nothing to go back to. And that was the goal, to leave not just the people of Gaza, but the international community with no option except to have them leave. Even people who I respect, people who I respect very much, not even, people who I respect very much, I've been having communications with them. They say, they've written me, there really is no choice at this point except to let them leave. And that's what Mr. Netanyahu, you can't squeeze them into a smaller space. Gaza was among the most densely populated places on God's earth before October 7th. So now you want to squeeze them into 1/4 of Gaza? That's simply communicating the message, you will not be able to live or breathe here. You have to leave. So nothing has changed. It's a combination of outright genocide and making Gaza uninhabitable in order to force the people to leave. Those who are alive, which, a large number will remain alive, even with the massive starvation, in order to leave, force them to leave, or, as Netanyahu said at one point, it was him, I believe, who said, to thin out Gaza, to thin it out. So I don't think anything has changed. There have been new differences in reaction. So Trump doesn't want the Gaza albatross, so he has to be somewhat attuned to international opinion. And secondly, Trump wants to deal with Saudi Arabia, and as he calls it, the deal of the century. And the Saudis, for face-saving reasons, have to extract something on Gaza if they're going to seal the deal. I read yesterday, I've not been following it closely, but I read yesterday that there's going to be an announcement between the French and the Saudis calling for a Palestinian state. I mean, this is so laughable. It's like in the middle of the Nazi Holocaust, talking about Germany is getting together with Italy to announce support for Israeli state.
Yeah.
What does that have to do with the reality we're currently facing? And as if there's any possibility of it, which is zero.
Well, Norman, what did you make of Trump going to these Gulf states? He went to Saudi Arabia. He went to the UAE. He also went to Qatar, I believe. And Gaza barely came up. I mean, he made one comment in passing about, people in Gaza are starving. We're going to take care of it. Other than that, none of these governments pressed Trump and seemed to get anything out of him to Gaza.
They don't care. They never cared. But there was a big difference. The big difference was that in the 1970s, for example, the Palestine issue had a lot of symbolic power. And it made the Arab leaders nervous that if they came out indifferent to the fate of the Palestinians, there was a price to be paid, maybe with a bullet in your head. So they were, and also popular outrage. So if you look at, for example, the case I know the best was the agreement that Egypt's Sadat signed with Israel. Now, the Sadat Israel agreement left nothing for the Palestinians. But Sadat didn't want to isolate himself from the Arab world. So Jimmy Carter, who was the president at the time, at Sadat's behest, he kept asking the Saudis, please endorse the agreement between Sadat and Israel, because Sadat needed the support of the Saudis, otherwise he would be completely isolated. The Saudis said, we can't do it unless you give something to the Palestinians. And so Carter goes back and tries to extract something face-saving for the Palestinians from, at that time, the Prime Minister Menachem Begin, so that the Saudis could say, we got something. And therefore, Sadat got something, some promise of a Palestinian state, and so the Saudis can endorse the Egypt-Israel agreement at Camp David, it was. But Begin said no, he wasn't willing to give anything substantive, some face-saving thing like local autonomy, but everybody knew that was a joke. The Saudis would not endorse Camp David between Sadat and Israel, and Egypt was expelled from the League of Arab Nations, and it was a pariah state. Now, they don't have to make any concessions to the Palestinians. They just have this silliness, like when the United Arab Emirates signed the so-called Abraham Accords. They said, we saved the West Bank from being annexed by Israel. Well, they did no such thing. Okay? And so now your memories don't go back very far in the conflict. There was a time, every time there was an Israeli attack, there would be a meeting of the Arab League, a meeting of the Arab League. There was not even any meetings. There were no resolutions. There were nothing. There was nothing. And so now, Saudi, it wants anything, just give us anything from Israel, more humanitarian aid, or maybe we support a state. Just give us something, anything, and we will go along. That was, in my opinion, the main reason for October 7th. The leadership of Hamas realized the Palestinian cause was dead. If you remember, on the eve of October 7th, the only question being asked was whether the Saudis would join the Abraham Accords. There was no talk about the Palestinians. So Hamas tried for a roll of the dice to bring international attention again to Gaza. I'm not going to pass judgment on how successful or unsuccessful it was. That's for them to decide over there. It vanished. And now, because of the genocide, Saudi has to have something to show. So that's why it's apparently going to make this announcement with France, or it's putting pressure on Trump to admit more humanitarian aid. It's all about the Saudis. That's the issue. Trump, whether he has a geopolitical vision, I kind of doubt it. He just has deals, business deals. That's all he cares about. And now there is a obstacle to the business deal. That obstacle is called Gaza. And so they have to figure out something face-saving so the Saudis can go along. The truth is they never gave a darn. But in the past, they were afraid of popular outrage. But that's a long time ago. Since the 70s, just in your generation. There was the destruction of Iraq, destruction of Syria, the destruction of Libya, the destruction of Yemen. And next to all of those horrors, Gaza kind of paled by comparison. If you look at the numbers just in the Saudi blockade of Yemen, I mean, the numbers are astonishing of how many children were killed. I think the figure is 100,000 due to the blockade of children killed. So for the Arab world, Palestine just doesn't loom very large anymore. The whole place has imploded. And therefore, there isn't that same feeling anymore. The Palestinian cause, up until October, it lost its symbolic power. Its symbolic power, of course, came back after October 7th and the ensuing genocide. And so the Saudis need to extract something face-saving, but that they care. I mean, you just ask yourself a simple question. Let's say Qatar didn't give the plane to Biden, and they just sold it and used the money for Gaza. You know, what is it? The plane worth $500 million?
600, I think. Yeah.
600. Yeah. So, but did anyone even think of that? That maybe the money could have been better used. Not even just for Gaza. I just got an email today from somebody who's in Egypt. And there are several, the estimates are between 100 and 200,000 refugees in Egypt. And Egypt won't integrate them. So they are in abominable situation. So there are these ad hoc organizations that have formed to feed and clothe the refugees in Egypt. You didn't need Israeli permission for that. Qatar could have sent $500 million of aid just to the refugees in Egypt. Nobody would have stopped them. It's a grim situation, and sometimes you have to accept there's just not much you can do. I think personally, if there were a coordinated action to close every Israeli consulate in the world, in every country, I think maybe the fervor has died down a little now since October 7th. I think you could have gotten significant numbers of people to participate and be willing to get arrested to close down every consulate over a sustained period of time. We're not letting the consulates open. And, to set a demand like Israel has to admit 1,000 trucks a day or we're not moving. It was possible. I think there was a certain lack of creativity about how to, at this particular juncture, what can be done. There were some possibilities. I think now the feeling of hopelessness has set in. And one of the main one of the important aspects of politics is you have to set goals which you can actually achieve. I don't mean just symbolic goals. They have to be significant and they have to be achievable. Why? Because you have to show people they have the power to change things. If you keep setting unachievable goals, people give up because they feel it's hopeless. They give up, it's hopeless. You have to set a goal, a political goal, which is significant but also achievable. Now, when you set a significant but achievable goal, what lesson do people get? Hey, we do have some power. We actually can change things if we are willing to make some sacrifices. We can change things. And one of the problems of the left has been, it has focused on unachievable goals, which sound radical, but in the end only diminish spirits. When you set goals like defund the police, abolish prisons, it's not going to happen. At least it's not going to happen now. You have to set very concrete goals which are achievable now. And so that needs to be figured out in the case of Gaza too. Right now, people feel like it's hopeless, that they can't change anything. I think if you set an achievable goal, like, in my opinion, closing the Israeli consulates with a willingness to go to jail, civil disobedience, a willingness to go to jail, it's an achievable goal to close the consulates. It'll be rough going. But it's an achievable goal, I believe. The question is whether now people have the spirit anymore.
I think people hopefully know that doing nothing is not an option.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking that even though we aren't seeing the change in policy that we desperately need, the shift in public opinion is, of course, necessary. It's insufficient, but it's necessary for anything to happen.
I've always been, because I've been around, I'm skeptical about how long-lasting how enduring these shifts in public opinion are. Remember, right after World War II, right after all of this anti-Nazi propaganda, who became our main ally in Europe? It became Germany. Sidney Poitier. So in 1954, he wins the Oscar for his performance in Lilies of the Field. It's about Sidney Poitier's relationship with 4 German nuns. Okay? And it makes the nuns out to be cranky and eccentric and, and isn't this beautiful between these eccentric, cranky German nuns and Sidney Poitier. But there was something very sinister happening in that film. Very sinister. You know what it was? It wanted to humanize the Germans because they were now our ally. Mm-hmm. And what was this colossal force of evil suddenly became some cranky, eccentric, idiosyncratic German nuns who have a relationship with a black man, Sidney Poitier. And isn't it beautiful?
So they say if only Hitler had become a painter, a successful painter, maybe the lesson is if only Hitler had become a nun.
But my point being, when the powers that be, when their agenda shifts, a pariah very quickly can metamorphose into an ally and even a kind of kooky friend. And that's, Netanyahu, I'm not going to sing the praises of his genius, but he counts on that. He figures, all right, we've got to solve the Gaza question. We've got to solve it now. This opportunity we have been waiting for and waiting for and waiting for. If you remember, right before, so this was written in 2002. So I'm just going to quote it. I'm quoting here Robert Fisk, the author, brilliant journalist. Every morning now, I awake beside the Mediterranean in Beirut with a feeling of great foreboding. There is a firestorm coming, and we are blissfully ignoring its arrival. Indeed, we are provoking it. And then I write, apart from being a moral abomination, expulsion of the Palestinians can set off a chain reaction in the Arab world that will make September 11th look like a pink tea. At that point, it was widely predicted that Israel would carry out the expulsion, which it had been longing for since 1967, to expel the Arabs from the areas it occupied. It didn't happen. It didn't happen, obviously, during the Iraq War. It didn't happen. And now, with October 7th, they saw the possibility. This is our once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to solve the Gaza question first, the West Bank question second, and maybe the big Megillah, the Iran question. And so from Prime Minister Netanyahu's point of view, we have to risk the momentary isolation, becoming a pariah state, because in his mind, in my opinion, not incorrectly, in his mind, it's a temporary thing. Yes, we risk it for 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, but at the outside 3 years. And then, guess what? You ready for this? People forget.
Yeah.
People forget. Do you remember when the head of the Saudi head crushed the bones of Khashoggi?
Jamal Khashoggi. Yes. Bones up. Yeah.
Journalist, the Washington Post journalist.
Yeah.
And he was ostracized, and Biden said, "I won't go near him."
Yeah.
Does anybody remember it now?
No.
Yeah.
So that's Netanyahu.
They changed it when the intelligence report came out after he promised to treat them as the pariah state. Yeah.
Well, let's hope in this case, truly, the mantra "never forgive, never forget" really will apply, because
maybe.
Yeah.
I'm a skeptic.
We've established that. We've definitely established that over the course of this interview. Norman Finkelstein, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm a skeptic, but that doesn't mean I'm right. I'm always, as I like to say, I'm always happy to be proven wrong.
Inshallah.
All right. Thanks, Norman.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks so much, Norman. As always, it's wonderful to be joined by Norman Finkelstein. This is a really long interview, so if you want to see the full interview, you can find that at usefulidiots.podcast.com.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Useful Idiots. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiots.podcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.